The minions are the most loved and most hated characters, and in this video I'm going to rank every single one of their movies. So how about we start with Despicable Me. Now, I'm not gonna lie, Despicable Me is probably the best minion movie on this list. So basically it's about a supervillain called Gru who wants to steal the moon. But to steal the moon he needs a shrink ray, but to get a shrink ray he needs funding from a company. But basically the company refuses to give him funding because now that he is old, and instead they're going to put all their money into the newer villains. However, Gru is having none of that, so he just decides to steal the shrink ray by himself. But a younger villain called Vector steals it before him. And so the rest of the movie is basically him trying to go back into his base so he can steal the shrink ray. But since he can't, he decides to adopt 3 orphan girls so he can use them as a distraction to steal the shrink ray. Eventually it works, but then he decides that stealing the moon is not good and he would rather be a father to these girls. The end. Overall, I would say the movie is pretty good, so that's why I'm going to put it in S tier. Next we have Despicable Me 2, which is probably the middest movie on this list. So basically it's about Gru getting a deal from the superhero agency to try and stop a supervillain, but he turns down the deal. But after one of his workers leaves, he finally decides to take it. And so the rest of the movie is basically him and Lucy trying to figure out who the supervillain is. But in the end, they actually try and find this sort of relationship, and so they decide to get in love. But then an epic supervillain comes in, who is trying to use Gru's minions to rule the world. But they stop him and Gru confesses love, so the end again. In the end, I would say that Despicable Me 2 is a B tier. And now we have Minions, the prequel to Despicable Me, showing how the Minions started working for Gru. But it doesn't really have looking for Gru, it's more looking for a supervillain. And it just is so, I don't know, like it's so confusing. So, 3 minions go on looking for a new supervillain because all the other supervillains that they tried to work for, they either ended up killing them or getting fired from the job.
You're fired!
And so, when they look for a new villain, they eventually find Scarlet Overkill. And she sends them to go steal a crown, but they fail, and Bob ends up becoming the King of England. But then Scarlet Overkill hunts them down, but then Kevin becomes a giant, but then they find Gru. It's just so confusing. I mean, like, why? Just why? C tier. Okay, what is next? Despicable Me 3 is by far the worst movie on this list. So basically, it's about them trying to catch a new supervillain, Evil Brad, who is jealous of Hollywood because he is no longer the character that he used to play because he got older. And I mean, you think he would just, accept that, but no, he has to turn into a goddamn supervillain and have to create a giant robot so he can destroy Hollywood. But of course, the Anti-Villain League try to stop him. But Gru and Lucy fail, so they get fired from their jobs. But then they get an invitation saying that Gru has a brother called Drew, and the rest of the movie is Gru hanging out with Drew, and then them going to steal the diamond off Evil Brad, so he can no longer destroy Hollywood. But then he steals it back off them, and then he goes to destroy Hollywood, and then it's just why? You could skip this movie and go straight on to Despicable Me 4, and it would still practically make sense when you watch it. D tier. Next up, we have Minions Rise of Gru, which is surprisingly a lot better than the first movie. The first movie was just really confusing and just somewhat kind of boring, but this one is actually really good. Well, really good? I don't know. It's a pretty fun movie. So basically, it's about Gru when he's a child, trying to become a supervillain. And so he goes up for this audition for the Vicious Six, but they decide to tell him no because he's too young. And so he just decides to steal a stone from them to make it look like he's a really good supervillain when he's really not. But then one of the minions sells it for a pet rock, and then the whole movie is about the minions trying to find this new stone. Overall, I would say that this movie is pretty good, so I'm going to put it in A tier. And finally, we have Despicable Me 4. So basically, Despicable Me 4 is about Gru going undercover because a villain is trying to catch him because he ruined his big night. And it's actually kind of fun to see Gru trying to blend in as a normal human being living a normal life, when really he is a superhero. The only complaints I really have with this movie is there is some bits of filler. Like there's one bit where it's about like Lucy being a hairdresser, and sometimes there's just a bunch of random scenes which don't really contribute to the actual story. But I would still say this movie is pretty fun, and we also get to see the Mega Minions, even though I'm pretty sure we've already seen like Mega Minions before, but I mean, it's still cool. I'm going to put this movie in A tier. Overall, I would say that the Minions movies are pretty good. They're nowhere near like Wall-E, but I can still watch them and enjoy them. Well, I mean, most of them. But if you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.